paper-thin rain. I didn't wake up because of the alarm, but because of a sound thin as someone tearing paper far away. The rain on the metal roof wasn't even, wasn't heavy, not loud enough to be called proper rain. It was more like a test layer of sound, as though the sky was practicing how to speak softly after many days of shouting. The room around me floated in a light that refused to give its name. If someone had asked whether it was morning or evening, I would have needed a few seconds to answer. The whole space seemed to hesitate between two sides, not yet choosing where it belonged. I lay still, not moving, staring at the ceiling blurred by that grayish light. I had the feeling the room had just opened its eyes at the same time I did, just as bewildered, and neither of us had been told what kind of day today was supposed to be, or which version of ourselves we were meant to become. There was no familiar noise from the street, no street vendors calling, none of those sounds that announce a normal day has begun. Only the thin rain tapping, like a person who doesn't know what to say and uses rhythm as a greeting. I reached out and touched the wall next to the bed. Cold. The kind of cold a wall has right after waking up, before it's had time to warm. For a brief moment I felt like I was a wall too, standing there, receiving rain, receiving wind, catching the shadows of people passing by, but not entirely sure I belonged in this house or some other house long gone. Instead of springing up like I usually do, I tried letting the morning, if this really was morning, pull me up more slowly. The first conscious breath is always different from the ones that happened while we were asleep. It carries a slight weight. I inhaled deeply, hearing my chest expand and contract, like an old door that still works, even though its hinges creak. Outside, water ran through low drainage pipes. A motorbike passed by, its tires slicing through the wet road, leaving behind a strip of sound longer than its appearance. I couldn't see it, but I could imagine. Someone wearing a helmet, raincoat not fully fastened, cold hands gripping the handlebars. They knew exactly what day it was, what time they had to get to work, how long before they hit traffic. I didn't. All I knew was that I was inside a hesitant room, in a day that hadn't made up its mind. I sat up. The tiled floor against my soles felt like a question. Cool, but not biting. As if the floor wanted to check whether I was really awake or just moving a dream into a thicker state. Slowly, I walked over to the window. The curtains were half drawn, a thin strip of light falling onto the floor like a dull table knife that can't cut anything except a few clumps of dust. The window glass was beaded with droplets. Tiny drops gathered into slow lines, dragging each other toward the bottom edge like a translucent column of ants. I lifted an index finger and drew a careless line on the cold surface. The mark appeared, then was immediately covered by a new layer of drops. There was a kind of stubbornness there, not mine, but the sky's, as if it wanted to say, any effort I make to write meaning onto today will have to compete with the weather. I turned my head slightly to catch my reflection on the glass. My face was flattened, stretched, twisted by the layer of water. Even I, through a thin sheet of rain, became uncertain. Half a living person, half a shadow that could be wiped away with a single swipe. There was something strange in realizing that it didn't take anything dramatic, just a morning like this, for my existence to feel a little thinner. In the kitchen, the electric kettle I didn't remember turning on started to hum. I didn't think I had done it unconsciously, yet clearly my hand had moved before my mind caught up. Some actions are like that, the two halves of myself out of sync but still managing to cooperate. I stepped into the kitchen, turned down the gas stove, lowered the flame. The fire shrank, calmer, like someone who had stopped shouting in order to speak in a normal voice. As the water began to tremble, the The room gained a second layer of background noise. Light rain outside, rising water inside. Two different rhythms, two different spaces, and standing between them, I felt like I was caught between two decisions. One made by the sky, one made by the stove. And I was the person stuck at their intersection. I poured the water into a cup, dropped a tea bag in, and watched the color start to bleed out. There was a very gentle comfort in that moment, watching hot water push color from a tea bag, like watching a silent thought stain a day that hasn't yet acquired any traits. I raised the cup up. The steam fogged my glasses. The world blurred again, but this time, not because of the rain. I carried the tea back to the window and sat down on a small wooden chair. The chair creaked under my weight, like a tired but friendly greeting. I took a sip. The tea hadn't steeped enough yet. The taste was only just forming, like a story that hasn't found its middle. I knew if I waited a few more minutes, the tea would grow stronger, heavier in scent, a little more bitter. Feelings left untouched are like that. They change color over time, sometimes into what we want, sometimes into what we tried to avoid. The rhythm of the rain outside shifted, no longer even. At times a burst of quick drops, then a thinning out. The sky sounded like someone trying out different bars of a song, still undecided about the tempo. I thought about decisive mornings, opening your eyes and immediately knowing what to do, where to go, whom to meet. Compared to those, this morning felt like a calendar page printed too faintly, the date smudged out, only the frame remaining. I wondered if it was because I was getting older that I paid so much attention to vague mornings like this. When I was young, I would probably have jumped up, grabbed whatever shirt was nearby, and rushed out the door without really noticing the color of the sky. I lived then the way people write notes, bullet points, capital letters, exclamation marks. Now, life feels more like extended commas, sentences that never quite end, just keep being joined on. I ran my hand over my forehead. My fingers crossed a small line there. Not deep, but clear enough for my fingers to recognize, like a newly opened path on the ground. I don't remember when it appeared. Maybe it came on just like this morning, no specific moment to name. One day, I simply looked in the mirror and saw a new line, like a pencil mark someone had drawn without asking me. The rain kept falling, but the light had shifted a little. I glanced at the wall clock. The minute hand was still moving slowly, indifferent to whether my morning was hesitant or not. Physical time doesn't know how to stand in between. It keeps going, whether we want to stay or not. Footsteps sounded from the apartment above. Not heavy, not hurried, steady like a simple drumbeat. I had no idea whether they were getting ready for work or just walking to get some water. For them, the room had probably made its decision. For me, it still hadn't. Part of me wanted to lie back down, pull the blanket over, and let the morning pass like a train that doesn't stop at my station. Another part, small but distinct, wanted to step out, to face whatever lay beyond those layers of thin rain. I thought of the days when decisions arrive in a second. A clean no, a firm step away, a door closing, a flight ticket bought, a resignation email sent. Those moments are often retold as turning points, but I've started to suspect that I've overlooked another kind of day, the ones with no clear choices, only tiny oscillations, very small ones, accumulating over months and years, until one day we look back and realize we've arrived on a different shore without noticing the crossing. Today's thin rain morning, perhaps, is one of those. I got up and eased open the balcony door. Air flowed in, carrying the damp smell of mossy walls and the earth of the little garden in the courtyard below. The smell reminded me of a narrow lane behind my childhood home, where I used to run to hide when I was scolded. Back then, I didn't know the word refuge. I just knew it was cool there, dim enough. And when it rained, the water came only halfway down the wall. My childhood had many such corners, places not quite indoors, not fully outside, a safe middle ground for a child who didn't like being seen while crying. Maybe that's why, growing up, I've always been drawn to in-between states, between two cities, between two jobs, between two people, between no longer loving and not yet able to hate. I've had plenty of mornings like this, but rarely allowed myself to look directly at their nature. I'm used to paying attention to clearer markers. The day something starts, the day it ends, the day you leave, the day you return. Meanwhile, most of life probably happens on days like today. Nothing significant enough to recount, but each one offering a small, clear example of how we stay with ourselves. The rain outside slowed, as though someone was gradually turning down a volume knob. The last drops on the roof sounded like lazy full stops. Yet if I looked up at the sky, I still saw the gray clouds hanging there, not dispersing, not gathering into a storm. I wondered, if the sky had moods, would it call a day like this a useless one? I thought about how we usually judge a day, how much we accomplished, how many goals we finished, what we gained, what we lost. Those measures are like the markings on a ruler, straight, even, clear. Days like this don't fit those measures. They're more like the torn edge of a sheet of paper, jagged, uneven, hard to measure, but all the more real to the touch. My phone vibrated on the table. I glanced over. A new notification, a work email, an article update from someone, an app reminding me that it's been a while since you trained today. All of them jostled to make me choose what mattered most. I reached out, almost picked it up, then stopped. I left it lying there face down, like a fish forced into sleep. Just like in another line you once wrote, "If the world really needs me so urgently, it will have to knock again." I turned back to the tea, now fully steeped. The next sip was heavier, warmer, its taste more defined. That change was simple, yet brought a small comfort. At least one thing in this room knows how to move from pale to strong without being told. I listened to the water knock lightly against the porcelain when I set the cup down, a small sound like someone knocking on a door from the inside. That sensation opened up a thought. Maybe some part of me, deep down, is also knocking on the wall of today, asking permission to live a little differently. I thought back over the past few weeks, appointments stacked on top of one another, unfinished work pulling in new tasks, conversations I only attended with half of myself. I said the necessary sentences, replied to messages that seemed to need answers, smiled when required. But somewhere, a very small part of me always stood on the sidewalk, watching everything unfold with the quiet fatigue of someone who has to attend meeting after meeting, but never gets their name on the minutes. Perhaps that's why this thin rain morning and hesitant room made me feel grateful. It was like an unannounced break in the meeting, when the entire system suddenly loses power and no one can keep pretending. Not a holiday, not a public break, just an unofficial middle space, gifted to me, unrecorded on any calendar. I walked a slow circle around the room. The objects that were always there looked different in this gray light. The book left open on the table, marked by a supermarket receipt. The chair next to the bed supporting an unfolded jacket. The shoes on the floor pointing their toes in two different directions, like boats that hadn't agreed on a harbor. Nothing special, yet suddenly it felt as if each item was holding a small version of me inside. The rushed days when I threw things off, the late nights when I was too tired to put them away, the evenings when I decided to read a few more pages, then sleep, and the many days after, when the book stayed open at the same place. I stopped in front of the mirror. It wasn't large, just enough to show me from the chest up. In it, my face looked clearer, less distorted than in the rain-streaked glass, but not necessarily more true. I tried smiling. The smile appeared, but didn't quite climb as far as my eyes. I didn't feel sad about that. I simply registered it, the way one notes a fine crack in a wall. It's been there, maybe for a long time, and the house still stands. I remembered something someone once said to me. People often judge their lives by explosive moments, but what actually changes them are the silent days. When I first heard it, it felt a bit sentimental, a little contrived. Now, standing in a room that hasn't decided between morning and night, it feels less so. Maybe because today, silence isn't just the absence of noise. It's a material you can touch. Outside, the rain must have stopped for real, because I could hear birds somewhere on the roof. Birds sound different in sunny weather. Light, crisp, like notation, scribbled into the white space of a bright score. Today, their calls were thicker, damp, as if they had passed through a layer of cloud before reaching my ears. I wondered if they could sense the room's hesitation, or if they simply sang by instinct, indifferent to whatever humans under their roof were wrestling with. That thought led to another, larger question I'd dodged many times. Do most of the things that weigh us down come from our habit of needing to decide everything too quickly? To decide what we belong to, which side we stand on, who we are, what we must do next. We're taught that hesitation is weakness, delay is a waste of time, indecision is our own fault. But if you look closely, the most important changes rarely happen in a single clean decision. They're prepared by hundreds, thousands of days like this one. Thin rain, hesitant rooms, everything inside us moving so slowly no one can see it. I went back to the chair and sat down. The tea was completely cold now. I finished it, feeling only a faint bitterness at the back of my tongue. My head wasn't suddenly lit by any brilliant idea, nor filled with fresh motivation, nor dragged into despair. I was somewhere between all those states, and for the first time in a long while, I wasn't trying to drag myself to any particular side. Maybe maturity at some level is learning to withstand these days, the ones that won't give you clear answers, with no noteworthy events to brag about online, no pretty pictures to save in a folder. Only you, sitting in a hesitant room, watching thin rain fall and realizing your heart is still beating, though a little slower. I looked out one last time. The sky was brighter, but not the kind of bright people call beautiful. If it were a person, today's light would be someone lingering at the door, unsure whether to enter or leave, afraid of intruding, yet unable to vanish. I felt a kind of tenderness for it, the way I occasionally feel tenderness toward myself when I can't decide whether to stay or go. Finally, I stood up and took a light jacket from the chair. No raincoat, no umbrella. I planned to go downstairs, buy some bread, maybe bring back a coffee. Not because I was hungry, just to see whether, beyond this hesitant room, the world had made its choices. My hand touched the doorknob. A small metallic sound rang out, clearer than anything I'd heard all morning. In that moment, I had a strange impression, as if the door itself was nodding at me, saying it had been waiting long enough. I opened it. A gust of air came in, carrying the smell of dampness and street. The rain had stopped, but the pavement outside was still wet, shining faintly in the new light. I stepped through, pulled the door closed behind me, and heard the hinge creak softly, like someone calling out an old name. The room on the other side remained, with the scent of tea and the creaky chair, with all the objects not yet rearranged. It stayed to hold on to some portion of my hesitation, so I could take the rest of it with me down the stairs. On my way down, I listened to the sound of my feet on each step. Every footfall, a small conclusion, short, promising nothing beyond bringing me a little closer to the ground. And perhaps, just as the rain had decided whether to fall or not, this morning had quietly chosen to be a day being lived, instead of just an extension of a dream. I didn't know if, by the time I came back in the evening, the room would be bright, dark, or lit by some other ambiguous tone. I only knew that, as I stepped over the threshold, I stopped asking it that question. I left the room to decide for itself, the way I'm learning to leave a few spaces in my life unsolved, not open, not closed, just wide enough for the wind to pass through. And in the very brief moment when my foot touched the ground floor, I heard thin rain again somewhere by the eaves. I couldn't tell whether it was still falling or simply the morning replaying itself inside my head. But somehow, that sound slowed the day just enough for me to take one deeper breath before pushing open the door and stepping out onto the street.